On a brittle winter night in the heart of Detroit, where the wind cut through alleyways like razors and even the streetlights seemed too tired to glow, Langston Drew stood alone inside his diner, the Hearthstone. The neon sign above the window sputtered like a dying firefly, casting flickers of dull orange across the cracked sidewalk. Inside, silence loomed like a second layer of frost. No clatter of plates, no idle chatter, just the hum of a refrigerator and the creaking groan of a heating pipe struggling to keep up with the cold. Langston wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, though there hadn't been a customer since lunch. His hands, rough and calloused, moved slowly, less out of necessity, and more because movement helped him forget how empty everything felt. The diner had once thrived, a humble but beloved spot passed down from his grandmother, who built it with the idea that a hot meal could warm more than just the body. But now the booth sat hollow and the coffee tasted more like memory than comfort. He glanced at the register. 3 crumpled dollar bills, a few coins. Not enough to pay a utility bill, let alone chip away at the growing mountain of debt pressing on his chest like wet cement. Outside creditors circled like vultures, and despite Langston's best efforts, the walls were closing in. He didn't blame the neighborhood. The whole block was deteriorating, factories, shuttered storefronts, boarded-up families, moving out like dust in the wind. What hurt more was the betrayal of time, that he had given his youth, his strength, his every waking moment to this place, only to watch it wither under his fingertips. As he leaned against the counter jacket zipped to the throat, he let out a sigh so heavy it fogged the window. That's when he saw her. A small figure hunched near the edge of the building, seated on the concrete, shivering violently under layers of mismatched fabric. Her gray hair peeked out from beneath a knit cap, and beside her sat a tattered duffel and an old cloth-wrapped bundle that looked as worn as her coat. Langston hesitated. The night was already too long, his spirit too thin. But then his grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. Clear, firm, loving, baby kindness only matters when it costs you something. He closed his eyes, cursed softly under his breath, and grabbed a second bowl from the shelf. The pot of soup on the stove was barely warm anymore, but it would do. He poured a serving, grabbed a thick slice of day-old bread, and walked outside into the bitter cold. "Ma'am," he said gently, his breath forming clouds. "You all right?" The woman flinched at the sound, then slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were pale and watery but alert. She didn't answer at first, just clutched the bundle on her lap tighter. "I don't mean any harm," Langston continued, lowering himself to her level. "It's cold. I've got a stove and some soup that's not half bad. You can warm up inside. Just for a little while." Her gaze lingered on him with the kind of caution only years of disappointment can create. But then, just barely, she gave a nod. Langston held out his hand. It took her a moment, but she reached for it, and together they moved slowly back toward the diner. He helped her into the booth nearest the heater. She didn't speak as he placed the bowl in front of her, just stared at it for a long second before lifting the spoon with a trembling hand. The scent of broth and herbs filled the space like a quiet hymn. Langston sat across from her, but said nothing, giving her the dignity of silence. It wasn't until she finished nearly all of it that he asked, voice barely above a whisper, "What's your name?" Her lips parted. The word came slow, like it had been tucked away for years. "Celia," she said. "Just that." Langston nodded, then stood to prepare a cot in the small storeroom behind the kitchen, threadbare mattress, a fleece blanket, and a folded towel. It wasn't much, but it was warm. When he returned, Celia was sitting a bit straighter, her hands now resting on the edge of the table instead of wrapped protectively around her bundle. As he showed her the way to the cot, Langston felt something shift, small, quiet, but certain. The kind of shift that didn't shout or demand anything. The kind of shift that reminded him of why the diner existed in the first place. That night, 2 strangers slept under the same roof. One on a worn mattress, the other on a creaky cot behind the kitchen. Outside, the wind howled. But inside the Hearthstone, for the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like a beginning. By morning, the scent of burnt coffee and yesterday's cinnamon still clung faintly to the walls of the Hearthstone. Langston unlocked the front door just after dawn, same as always, expecting the familiar echo of his own footsteps and the hush of a place that had forgotten how to breathe. But what greeted him instead was the soft swish of a broom. He stopped in the doorway. There near the windows was Celia, bent slightly at the waist, thin arms wrapped in 2 oversized sweaters, She was sweeping the floor in quiet, methodical strokes. The broom looked too heavy for her frame, yet she moved with surprising steadiness, like someone who wasn't unfamiliar with hard work. She hadn't heard him come in, or if she had, she didn't react, just kept cleaning. Langston blinked. "Morning," he said softly. She paused, looked up, and offered him a faint smile. "Thought I'd earned that soup from last night." There was no pride in her voice. No false humility either. Just calm, grounded. Like sweeping someone's diner before sunrise was the most natural thing in the world. Langston, still rubbing the sleep from his eyes, didn't know what to say, so he walked behind the counter and started the coffee. He poured her a cup and brought it over. She took it with a quiet thank you, holding it close like a small fire. They sat across from each other at a corner booth that caught a little sliver of morning light. The city outside was still groggy buses, hissing to life, a few scattered footsteps on wet concrete. But in that booth, things felt strangely still. After a few sips, Celia broke the silence. "My son lives just 2 neighborhoods over," she said without warning, eyes fixed on the rising steam from her cup. "I haven't seen him in 3 years." Langston didn't respond. He didn't ask. Something in her voice told him this wasn't an invitation to console, just a moment of truth she needed to let exist in the air. He said I was slowing them down, that he and his wife didn't have room for extra baggage, she added with a half laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "They packed me a suitcase, left it by the door like a donation box." Langston sat very still. He didn't press for more. "What was there to say I didn't tell you that for sympathy?" she added after a moment. "Just, when someone offers you soup and warmth without asking questions, it does something. It chips away at the shame." That line stuck with him. He didn't know what to do with it, not yet, but it landed somewhere deep. He got up and pulled a few ingredients from the pantry. Nothing fancy, just flour, sugar, and a bit of nutmeg, and started mixing dough. Celia watched for a while, then slowly stood and joined him behind the counter without asking. "You bake?" he asked. "Used to. Long time ago. Before arthritis and eviction notices became my full-time job." He handed her the rolling pin. "Let's see if you still got it." By noon, the diner smelled like fresh scones and honey butter. The radio hummed in the background. Celia moved with focus, measuring, shaping, kneading, her eyes brighter than they had been the night before. Langston watched her in moments, marveling at how quickly someone could slip into a rhythm, even after years of being silenced by the world. A man came in off the street, then a woman in scrubs. Regulars who hadn't visited in weeks wandered back, noses leading the way. Langston poured coffee and Celia offered samples of her pastries, just small pieces on napkins. Nothing fancy, but each one carried the kind of warmth you couldn't fake. They didn't talk much, but something was building between them. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but a kind of shared silence that wasn't empty. It felt full. Trust was a long road, but this was the first step. Later that afternoon, while refilling napkin holders, Langston glanced over and saw Celia wiping down the pie case with slow, steady movements. She was humming just barely, like she didn't even know she was doing it. It wasn't a happy song, but it wasn't a sad one either. It sounded like memory. That night after closing, Langston laid a clean blanket over Celia's cot without her noticing. He placed a small tray nearby, a thermos of hot water, a tea bag, and a note written on the back of a receipt. "Tomorrow we try cinnamon. Sleep well." He turned off the lights and stood at the front window for a while, watching the city blink in and out through the frost. He didn't know what this was between them. 2 people with nothing left to give, somehow giving each other something again. But it felt right. Like maybe the hearthstone hadn't died. Maybe it had just been waiting for someone else to come light the stove. And tonight it was burning quietly, but it was burning again. The next few days passed in a rhythm Langston hadn't felt in years. The hearthstone was still far from thriving, but the diner breathed again. Mornings began with the smell of flour and coffee. A few regulars returned, drawn in by the scent of Celia's baking and the inexplicable warmth that seemed to gather in the corners of the room. There were still long hours without customers, and the bills on Langston's desk hadn't magically disappeared, but something had changed. The silence no longer felt hollow. It felt full of possibility. On the 5th morning, Celia was already in the kitchen when Langston arrived. She was kneading dough like a woman who had done it in another lifetime. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows, gray hair tied back in a loose knot. "I was thinking we try hand pies today," she said without looking up. "People like food they can walk away with. It makes them feel like they're moving forward." Langston chuckled under his breath. "You just trying to feed folks or writing poetry?" Now Celia gave him a sly glance. Why can't it be both? But later that same day, as Langston sat behind the counter, sorting through overdue notices and declining messages from his credit union, a different kind of silence crept in. The kind that came just before a storm. He barely noticed it until the front door slammed open so hard the bell above it jumped off its hook. 3 men stepped inside. The tallest of them, thick in the shoulders and wrapped in a worn leather coat, walked like a man used to getting what he wanted. His eyes scanned the diner with calculated disdain. Behind him, the other 2 flanked his sides like shadows, lean, restless, and looking for trouble. Langston stood, instinct tightening his shoulders. He knew who they were. He'd been dodging their calls for weeks, hoping the small payments he sent when he could would buy him time. But time, it seemed, had just run out. The leader stepped forward, smirking. "Well, well. Looks like business is booming," he said, gesturing to the empty booths with mock cheer. "You forgot about our arrangement." Mr. Drew Langston stayed quiet. His hands rested calmly on the counter, but his pulse was hammering. "I haven't forgotten. I just don't have it yet." "That's the thing about owing money," the man replied, his tone sharpening. "It doesn't wait for yet." He leaned in voice, lowering to a growl. "We've been generous, but generosity has a limit." Langston opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the swinging door to the kitchen creaked. Celia stepped out, wiping her hands on a flour-stained towel. She froze when she saw the men. Then one of them, Travis, turned his head and their eyes met. The room went still. Langston glanced between them, confused by the sudden shift in energy. Travis's face, moments ago twisted in dominance, now faltered. He blinked once, twice. Mom Langston's head snapped toward Celia. She stared at Travis like she was looking at a ghost. Her lips parted, but no words came. Only silence. A long, stunned silence. Then slowly she stepped forward. "Travis," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The air cracked with something unseen. Travis straightened as if pulled back into his role by sheer force. "What are you doing here?" he barked. "Working in this dump, baking for beggars?" Langston stiffened. "Watch your mouth." Travis turned to him with a sneer. "Oh, I see. She's your new charity case now. You think because she's old and pitiful she belongs to you. She's not a case," Langston said, voice low but steady. "She's a person. A good one. Better than you." Celia stepped between them, hands shaking but firm. "Don't do this, Travis." But Travis was already unraveling. Anger and shame twisted his features. "So this is what you've become, taking handouts from strangers. You think that makes you noble?" And then before anyone could stop him, he shoved her. Celia's body crumpled backward into a chair that tipped sideways, sending her to the ground with a dull, sickening thud. Langston didn't think. His body moved before his brain could catch up. He vaulted over the counter, crossed the diner in seconds, and stood over her protectively. His voice came out louder than he intended. "Get out!" The room pulsed with tension. The other 2 men looked at Travis, waiting for direction. But Travis, for once, was quiet. His gaze flickered between Langston and the woman on the floor, his own mother shaking, holding her elbow. Langston helped Celia up gently. "Are you okay?" he asked. She didn't answer. Just nodded faintly, her eyes never leaving her son's. That was when the fear in the room began to shift, not toward Langston, but toward Travis. And he felt it too. The control he walked in with was slipping fast. But no one in the room yet knew that Celia Marlowe hadn't just come to bake bread or borrow shelter. She had something more, something she'd been holding on to for years. And tonight the past wasn't the only thing that had come knocking. Justice, it seemed, had followed close behind. The diner felt frozen in time. Chairs sat askew, untouched plates of food, slowly cooled on abandoned tables. And the only sound was the low hiss of the fryer, left running in the kitchen. Langston stood firm beside Celia, his arm braced gently against her back as she steadied herself. She hadn't spoken a word since the fall, but her eyes, still locked on her son, were sharper than Langston had ever seen them. Not angry, not pleading, just resolute. Travis took a step forward, his voice cracking with some twisted mixture of confusion and fury. You think this makes you a hero, he spat toward Langston. You don't know her. You don't know anything about sit down, Celia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Travis froze mid-sentence. Celia turned to Langston and touched his arm the way a mother would calm a child. It's all right. I've got this, she said softly. Then she faced her son fully. If you're going to humiliate me, Travis, let's not do it halfway. Take a seat. Travis didn't move, so she reached down and picked up the cloth bundle she dropped when she fell. It was that same bundle Langston had seen her carry since the first night, always close, always clutched to her chest like something sacred. She placed it gently on the table between them and began untying the layers. Her fingers moved slowly, methodically, as if unwrapping something more than fabric. Something older, something heavy with memory. The final layer peeled back, and the room collectively seemed to hold its breath. Inside was a thick stack of cash, tightly bound with an old ribbon, faded but still strong. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. Crisp, unmarked, quiet proof of a lifetime no one had been paying attention to. Travis's eyes widened. Where the hell did you get that? I saved it, Celia said simply. Little by little, over years. Cleaning houses, selling trinkets, doing whatever I could while you weren't looking. I hid it from you, from your wife, from the banks. From everyone. She looked up at Langston now, not at her son, and held his gaze with warmth and quiet pride. I was saving it for a day when I could help someone who saw me as more than a burden. She stood up slowly, picked up the bundle and walked it over to Langston. His hands instinctively went up, refusing. No, Celia, I can't take that. But she pressed it gently into his chest. You can, and you will. Because I won't carry this any longer. Not the money, not the shame, not the silence. Langston took the bundle, stunned, his throat tight. He had no words, only the sharp sting in his eyes and the heaviness in his chest that he'd come to recognize as gratitude too big to name. Celia turned back to her son. You want money? She said, her voice low and steady. There it is. But not from you, not because you deserved it, and certainly not because you earned it. Travis stood there, shoulders drawn tight, face pale with rage and something else, humiliation. You cast me out of your home like I was garbage, and now you come into his home like you own the place, she continued. I raised you better than this, Travis. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I gave you too much and expected you to know what it meant. She stepped closer. Her voice didn't rise, but the strength in it deepened. I may have failed as a mother, but today I choose to do right by someone who would never raise a hand to me, who protected me when you didn't. For a moment, Travis looked like he might say something, but then the heat in the room shifted. The two men behind him, his usual shadows, exchanged glances. Uncomfortable. Silent. The bravado they wore like armor began to crack. One of them muttered, "Let's go, man." Travis didn't move. The other added, "This ain't it, bro." Finally, Travis took a breath. And then, wordless, he turned on his heel and walked out the door. His boots striking the floor too hard, too fast, like someone trying to escape the sound of their own guilt. The others followed without a backward glance. The door slammed shut behind them, and just like that, they were gone. Langston looked at Celia, still holding the bundle of bills in both hands like it might vanish if he blinked. The woman in front of him wasn't frail anymore. She stood tall, back straight, eyes clear. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but she cut him off with a small, gentle smile. You gave me shelter, she said. I gave you peace of mind. Feels fair, doesn't it? Langston didn't answer. He just nodded, swallowed hard, and finally exhaled the breath he'd been holding for weeks. The following morning, the diner felt different. Not just warmer, but lighter, like a storm had passed and left something behind. Langston arrived earlier than usual, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He didn't know exactly what he expected to find, maybe Celia still sleeping, or maybe gone without a word. But there she was in the kitchen, already covered in flour and wearing one of his old aprons. She didn't look up when he stepped in, just pointed her chin toward the prep table and said, "The coffee's fresh. I hope you're ready. We've got work to do." Langston laughed under his breath and reached for a mug. The bundle of money had stayed on the counter overnight. Neither of them had touched it. In the end, it wasn't about the money anyway. It was about something that had taken root quietly, stubbornly between them. Trust, dignity, a kind of shared rebuilding. They didn't talk about Travis, not that morning, not in words anyway. But there was something unspoken in the way Celia moved slower than usual, more careful with her left arm, where she'd fallen, and in the way Langston hovered nearby, always within reach. Around noon, a young couple walked in. They looked tired, cold, holding hands a little too tightly for it to be casual. Langston greeted them with his usual warm nod, but before he could get their order, Celia leaned across the counter and whispered something to him. He paused, then nodded. When the couple asked for coffee and just a side of toast, Langston brought them 2 full plates, eggs, biscuits, sausage. The young man tried to protest, fumbling for his wallet. Langston held up a hand. "Already paid for," he said with a smile. "Someone came by earlier and left a little extra. Said to pay it forward." The couple blinked, surprised, unsure whether to believe him. "Just eat," Celia added gently. "You'll need your strength. Cold out there today." That moment was the seed. The next day, Langston scribbled a note on a piece of cardboard and taped it near the register. "Take what you need, leave what you can, pay it forward." People noticed. Some rolled their eyes, but others, they paused. An old man dropped a 20 without ordering anything. A single mom left 2 homemade muffins from her bakery job. One kid came in every afternoon and gave Langston a drawing he'd made at school payment. He insisted for the free hot chocolate. Celia snuck him when no one was looking. Word spread not fast but steadily. The Hearthstone wasn't just open again, it was alive. And in the evenings, when the last customer had gone and the chairs were flipped upside down onto tables, Celia would sit by the window with a notebook in her lap, scribbling ideas for new recipes. Langston would refill her tea and ask if she needed anything. Just one thing she'd say with a smirk: "Less salt in your biscuits." People don't need their hearts broken and their blood pressure spiking. They bickered like old family, the kind that hadn't grown up together, but somehow still belonged to one another. Sometimes Langston wondered what the place looked like to strangers passing by, 2 figures moving behind fog glass, sharing the weight of survival with quiet grace. They didn't look like a success story, but maybe that's what made them one. Late one night as he locked up, he caught Celia wiping down the "Pay It Forward" sign with the edge of her apron, like it was something sacred. "You ever think," she said softly, not looking at him, "that a little kindness could be louder than a whole life of noise?" Langston nodded, keys jingling in his hand. "I do now." Outside, the street was still rough. The neighborhood was still hurting, but the Hearthstone was different. It wasn't perfect, and it still struggled, but it had a pulse again. And at the center of it all was a woman who'd been discarded by her own family and found a new one among cracked tiles, sticky menus, and a man who just needed someone to believe in him long enough to keep going. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined the future. A few months passed. Snow gave way to slush and slush to the first hints of spring. The Hearthstone stayed steady, never crowded, but never empty. It wasn't just a diner anymore. It had become a place people gravitated toward when they didn't know where else to go. A safe little pocket in a loud and often indifferent city. Then one morning, just as Celia was pulling a batch of orange cardamom scones from the oven, Langston's phone buzzed on the counter. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another spam call or maybe a vendor trying to collect. But something made him answer. His face shifted as he listened. Concern deepened across his brow. He glanced at Celia, then turned away slightly, speaking in a hushed voice. When he hung up, he didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring out the front window at nothing in particular. "What is it?" Celia finally asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Langston turned slowly. That was Officer Reyes, from the 8th Precinct. "Said they just picked up Travis, your son?" Celia's hands stilled. Langston continued carefully. "Turns out someone recorded what happened here that night. A bystander posted it online. Went viral, at least locally. Caught the assault, the threats, even the part where he tried to extort me. Someone recognized him and reported it." Celia lowered herself slowly into the nearest chair. "He's being held now," Langston added gently. "Charged with misdemeanor battery and, get this, operating a predatory lending ring under the table. They're calling it unlicensed lending and intimidation, a violation under state law. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, so, he's finally being stopped. Langston sat across from her. Yeah, looks like it. Celia let out a breath long, hollow, and tangled. Relief wasn't the right word. Not exactly. Neither was sadness. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. She looked at her hands instead, thin fingers, curled slightly from age and work, and nodded faintly. You'd think I'd be broken over it, she murmured. But I'm not. Maybe because this was always coming, or maybe because now he'll have to stop hurting people. Maybe this is the one thing that might force him to change. Langston reached out and placed a hand over hers. Warm, solid. You didn't cause this, Celia. I know, she said softly, but I loved him. I still do. That doesn't mean I protect the worst parts of him anymore. She stood up slowly, steadier now, and walked toward the back window. The sun had just begun to spill through the blinds, casting long golden stripes across the linoleum floor. And maybe, she continued almost to herself, this is what accountability looks like. Not punishment, just a pause. A place to stop the spiral before it gets deeper. Langston leaned back in his chair, watching her. This woman who had arrived at his door in silence and was now speaking with the weight of generations behind her. Her pain, her hope, her strength, it all echoed in her voice. By noon, the news had trickled through the community. A few customers came in, eyes full of sympathy. No one said anything outright, but they lingered longer than usual. They helped clear plates. One even left a bouquet of daffodils on the counter. That afternoon, Celia stepped out from the kitchen with a plate of fresh pastries and said to Langston, "Let's set up a donation jar by the register." He looked at her. For what? She smiled, faint but fierce. For anyone else trying to get away from someone like Travis. Langston's chest tightened. Then he nodded, because of course she would think of that. They wrote the words together, for the next person who needs a way out. Pay it forward. It was simple. But sometimes simple things change the most. That evening, after the last customer had gone, Celia sat near the window again. The sun dipped below the skyline, painting everything in dusky amber. She held her tea close, sipping it slowly. Langston turned off the open sign but left the lights on inside just a little longer. Outside, Detroit kept moving fast and loud. But inside the Hearthstone, something stayed soft and still. The past had come back. It had knocked loud, demanded to be seen. And now finally it had passed. Not forgotten, but faced. The weeks that followed settled into something steady, not easy, not perfect, but real. Langston often found himself watching the world through the large front window, coffee in hand, as familiar faces trickled in and out. Some came for the food, others for the warmth. A few came simply to sit in silence, as if the Hearthstone had become a kind of sanctuary from the noise of everything outside. Celia stayed, not just as a guest, but as part of the soul of the place. Every morning she arrived before sunrise with a new recipe scribbled in her notebook, wearing that same old coat she refused to replace. She kept her flour tins labeled with tape and taught Langston to fold pastry with purpose, not panic. The laughter between them became a kind of music, soft, sometimes dry, always earned. But more than anything, Celia became the heartbeat behind the counter. It was her idea to run the kindness wall, a simple corkboard where people could pin notes for others' job postings, rides offered extra gloves poems. One afternoon, a boy left a note that simply read, "To whoever needs it most, I believe in you." Someone replied, "The next day I needed that more than you know." Langston began to realize the Hearthstone wasn't just surviving anymore. It was growing roots. Not in money, not in foot traffic, but in meaning. It was a space being shaped by the people who walked through its door. A kind of living story stitched together by those who knew what it was to go without, and who now somehow had enough to give. And Celia, despite everything she had lost, had become a compass for all of it. One evening near closing, Langston sat across from her, wiping his hands on a towel. "You ever think about leaving, doing something else?" She smiled, slow and sure. "I used to think I had nowhere to go," she said. "Now I realize I'm already home." Langston nodded, understanding what she meant without needing to say anything. He watched her then, this woman who had once arrived with nothing but a bundle and a quiet gaze, now settled into her chair like she belonged to the very bones of the building. And in a way she did. That night, as the city lights flickered awake and the street outside thinned into silence, Celia stood in front of the oven sliding out the last tray of scones. She set them down gently on the counter, the golden tops steaming in the warm kitchen air. Langston walked over and stood beside her shoulder to shoulder. "We could make this official," he said casually, almost as if he weren't offering her something sacred. "You, staying here, helping run the place." She glanced at him, brows raised. He smiled. "Call it a partnership, or better yet, just call it what it is. You're the reason this place came back to life." Celia didn't answer right away. She looked around, the light bouncing off the pie case, the worn stools that now seemed full, even when they were empty, the faint scent of vanilla and something warmer than that, and nodded. "Then let's make sure it stays alive," she said. They didn't shake on it. They didn't need to. The hearthstone had begun as a last chance for a man with too many regrets. Now it was something else entirely, a beacon, a gathering place, a patchwork of second chances. And at the center of it all, a woman once discarded by her own family now stood tall, sleeves dusted with flower, eyes steady and kind. She didn't need revenge. She didn't even need closure. What she had now was purpose. And sometimes that's all we're really searching for. Not to rewrite the past, but to help someone else write a better future. The hearthstone was still a humble diner, still creaked in the cold, still ran out of cream on Mondays, but now it had something more. It had soul. And as the lights dimmed that night and the scent of warm bread lingered in the air, you could feel it, quiet, simple, true. This was no longer just a place to eat. It was a place to heal. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful Black stories and life lessons that stay with you long after the screen fades. Thank you for watching. Your support means the world.